Welcome to this journey into one of Rhode Island's most disturbing and meticulously hidden mysteries. Before we begin, I want to know where you are watching this from and what time it is in your location. Drop a comment below telling us your city and whether you're watching this during the day or in the darkness of night. It helps us understand our community of truth seekers who gather here to uncover stories that history tried to bury. This is a story that takes us back to 1921, to the windswept shores of Rhode Island, where the Atlantic crashes against ancient rocks and fog rolls in thick enough to hide secrets for generations. This is the story of Linda Heiress, a name that once commanded respect in the highest circles of New England society, a woman whose philanthropic work was celebrated in newspapers from Providence to Boston, whose charity galas drew senators and industrial magnates. But Linda Heiress was not who she appeared to be. In the spring of 1921, during what should have been her triumph, a grand benefit ball at the family estate known as Blackwood Mansion, Linda Heiress vanished without a trace. The disappearance of such a prominent figure sent shockwaves through Rhode Island's elite. Search parties combed the rocky coastline. Police investigators descended upon the sprawling Gothic mansion that had been in the Heiress family for 3 generations. What they found during that investigation would not be released to the public for decades. What they discovered hidden within the walls of Blackwood Mansion challenged everything the community believed about their beloved heiress. They found a diary. But this was not the innocent chronicle of a young woman's thoughts. This was something else entirely, a confession, a manual, a window into a mind that had cultivated darkness while wearing the mask of light. The diary was discovered sealed behind false paneling in the mansion's basement, wrapped in black silk, its leather cover worn smooth by countless readings. The pages contained detailed accounts of activities that contradicted everything Linda Heiress had presented to the world. The Heiress family lawyers immediately moved to suppress the diary's contents. They claimed privacy, they invoked family dignity, they threatened legal action against anyone who might speak of what was written in those pages. For decades, only a handful of investigators and historians knew the full truth. The diary itself disappeared into private collections, its location unknown. But fragments survived, witness testimonies were recorded. Police reports, though heavily redacted, still exist in archive boxes in Providence. And over the years, people who had seen the diary, investigators who had read its pages before it vanished, began to share what they remembered, piece by piece, until a picture emerged. A picture of a woman who lived 2 completely separate lives. By day, Linda Heiress was everything a woman of her station should be. She organized charity drives for war veterans returning from the Great War. She funded the construction of a children's hospital. She hosted literary salons where the intellectual elite discussed poetry and philosophy. Newspapers called her the Angel of Rhode Island. Her photograph appeared regularly in society pages, always impeccably dressed, always composed, always smiling that enigmatic smile. But at night, according to the diary, Linda Heiress became something else. The mansion itself seemed to reflect this duality. From the front, approaching up the long gravel drive lined with ancient oaks, Blackwood Mansion appeared as a statement of Victorian elegance. 3 stories of dark stone and towering windows, immaculate gardens, a view of the Atlantic that had inspired painters and poets. But the architecture held secrets. There were rooms that did not appear in the official floor plans. There were passages between walls. There was an entire basement level that servants whispered about, but never entered. When Linda Heiress disappeared on that April night in 1921, she was 28 years old, at the height of her social power, with a fortune that could have sustained generations. She simply walked away from her own party, from hundreds of guests, from a life that appeared perfect in every way, and she was never seen again. The question that haunted investigators then and continues to haunt us now is simple. Did Linda Heiress flee to escape the revelation of her true nature? Was she silenced by those who discovered what she had become? Or did something far stranger occur within the walls of Blackwood Mansion that night? Something that even the forbidden diary could not fully explain. What we know is this: the diary existed, its contents were real, and what was written in those pages revealed a descent into darkness that challenges our understanding of human nature itself. To understand the story of Linda Heiress and Blackwood Mansion, we must first understand Rhode Island in the early 20th century, a place where old money, older superstitions, and industrial-age isolation created a unique and often unsettling social landscape. Rhode Island in 1921 was a state of stark contrasts. In Providence and Newport, industrial wealth had created a new aristocracy, families who had made fortunes in textiles, shipping, and manufacturing. These families built mansions that rivaled European palaces, threw parties that lasted for days, and maintained a rigid social hierarchy that determined every aspect of upper-class life. But beyond the cities, Rhode Island remained a place of small coastal villages, fishing communities, and vast stretches of wilderness, where old colonial-era beliefs still held sway. The Heiress family belonged to the oldest tier of Rhode Island society. They were not new money. The family fortune had been established in the shipping trade during the colonial period, expanded through textile mills in the 19th century, and by 1921 had grown into a vast portfolio of properties, investments, and businesses. They were what New England called founding families, descendants of the original colonial settlers who had established Rhode Island as a haven for religious dissenters in the 1600s. Blackwood Mansion had been built in 1847 by Linda's great-grandfather, Josiah Heiress, on a remote promontory overlooking the Atlantic. The location was deliberate, isolated from the growing cities, separated from neighboring estates by miles, a rocky coastline and dense forest. The mansion's architecture reflected the Gothic Revival style popular in that era. Dark stone facades, pointed arch windows, steep gables, and an overall atmosphere of brooding permanence. Local folklore had always treated the mansion with a certain wariness. The promontory on which it stood was known to older residents as Widow's Watch, a name that predated the mansion itself. In colonial times, it had been the site of reported witch gatherings, though whether these were actual historical events or simply the paranoia of Puritan settlers remains unclear. What is documented is that several women were accused of witchcraft in that area during the late 1600s, and at least 2 were executed. The Heiress family never publicly acknowledged these stories, but there were peculiarities in how they related to the local community. The family maintained a strict separation between themselves and the town. Servants were hired from outside the region. The family rarely attended local churches, instead hosting private religious services within the mansion. When family members did venture into town, it was always brief, transactional, and formal. Linda Heiress was born in 1893, the only child of Edmund and Catherine Heiress. Her childhood was one of extreme privilege, but also profound isolation. She was educated by private tutors within the mansion. She traveled extensively with her parents to Europe, spending winters in Paris and summers in the Swiss Alps. By all accounts, she was an extraordinarily intelligent child, fluent in French and German by age 12, accomplished in piano and painting, well-read in classical literature and philosophy. But she was also notably solitary. Servants who worked at Blackwood Mansion during Linda's childhood later reported that the young girl spent hours alone in the mansion's extensive library, that she wandered the coastal rocks regardless of weather, and that she had what one governess described as an unsettling interest in the darker aspects of human history. When Linda was 16, both of her parents died within 6 months of each other. Edmund Heiress succumbed to pneumonia in January 1909. Catherine Heiress died in July of the same year under circumstances that were never fully explained, officially recorded as a fall down the mansion's main staircase, though some household staff whispered of other possibilities. At 16, Linda inherited everything. The fortune, the mansion, the family businesses, all transferred to her control under the management of family lawyers until she reached legal majority. This was an unusual situation, even for that era, and it granted Linda a level of autonomy that few women of her generation possessed. She used that autonomy in ways that initially seemed admirable. Upon reaching 21 in 1914, Linda threw herself into philanthropic work with impressive energy. The Great War was raging in Europe, and Linda organized fundraising drives for war relief. She established scholarships for working-class children. She funded medical research. She became a prominent figure in Rhode Island society precisely at a time when women were beginning to claim more public roles. But there were always whispers. Servants reported strange occurrences within Blackwood Mansion, lights in windows of rooms that were supposed to be locked and unused, sounds from the basement late at night, deliveries that arrived after dark, brought by unfamiliar people who never spoke to the household staff. Linda's personal quarters were absolutely off-limits. Even the head housekeeper was forbidden to enter without explicit permission. The staff also noted Linda's schedule. During periods of charitable work and social events, she was vibrant, energetic, the perfect hostess, but then she would withdraw for days or even weeks, remaining entirely within the mansion, seeing no one, issuing instructions only through written notes slipped under doors. Neighboring estates and local townspeople developed theories. Some thought Linda was simply eccentric, the result of her isolated upbringing and the trauma of losing both parents so young. Others whispered about inherited madness. There were rumors that Catherine Heiress had suffered from severe melancholy, though the family had always denied this. A few of the older residents, those who remembered the colonial-era stories, spoke of curses and bloodlines and suggested that the Heiress family had never been quite right. What no one suspected, what no one could have imagined, was the truth that would emerge from the forbidden diary. In the years leading up to 1921, Linda Heiress had perfected her dual existence. To society, she was the model of progressive philanthropy, a modern woman using inherited wealth for social good. To a much smaller, carefully selected circle of individuals, she was something entirely different, a patron of forbidden knowledge, a collector of occult texts, a woman who had dedicated herself to exploring the darkest territories of human experience. The diary would reveal that Linda had been conducting this double life for nearly a decade, that she had developed contacts throughout New England and even in Europe who shared her interests, that Blackwood Mansion had been transformed section by section into something far removed from a family estate, and that people had disappeared, people whose absence had been noted but never connected, whose fates had never been investigated because they were the kind of people society found easy to overlook. The events that would expose Linda Heiress began on April 16, 1921, with what should have been her greatest social triumph, the Spring Benefit Gala at Blackwood Mansion. Linda had spent months organizing the event. It was to be the largest charitable gathering of the season, with proceeds designated for the new Veterans Hospital being constructed in Providence. Invitations had been sent to over 300. Guests representing the absolute pinnacle of New England society. The mansion had been prepared with meticulous attention. Rooms opened that had been closed for years, gardens manicured to perfection, staff brought in from Boston to handle the elaborate dinner service. The guest list read like a directory of regional power: industrialists, politicians, judges, physicians, prominent clergy, and the cream of Rhode Island's oldest families. For Linda, this represented more than charity. It was a statement of her position, a demonstration that despite her youth and unmarried status, she commanded respect in circles where women typically deferred to men. The evening began flawlessly. Guests arrived by automobile and carriage, proceeding up the long drive to the mansion's imposing entrance. A string quartet played in the main hall. Champagne flowed. Linda moved through the crowd with practiced grace, a vision in a dark green silk gown, her dark hair arranged in the fashionable style of the era. Multiple witnesses later testified that she appeared entirely normal, cordial, engaged, showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock in the mansion's grand dining room. The meal proceeded through multiple courses over 2 hours. Linda sat at the head of the table, flanked by Judge Harrison Whitmore and Senator Charles Blackwell. Conversation was animated, focused on politics, business prospects, and charitable endeavors. Several guests, specifically, remembered Linda discussing plans for expanding her philanthropic work, talking enthusiastically about a new initiative to provide housing for displaced workers. After dinner, guests moved to various rooms throughout the mansion's ground floor for coffee, cigars, and continued socializing. A small orchestra had been brought in, and dancing began in the ballroom. This was the height of the evening, the moment when rigid social protocols relaxed slightly, when connections were made and alliances formed beneath the glittering chandeliers. Linda was last definitively seen at approximately 10:45 p.m. She had been speaking with Margaret Ashford, the wife of a prominent industrialist, near the ballroom's western windows. Mrs. Ashford later testified that Linda had suddenly paused mid-conversation, turned toward the mansion's interior, and said something peculiar. "I must attend to something in the study. Please excuse me. I'll return shortly." Mrs. Ashford thought nothing of it at the time. As hostess, Linda had countless details to manage, but Linda Heiress never returned to the ballroom. At first, her absence went unnoticed. With over 200 guests scattered throughout the ground floor, it was easy to assume Linda was simply in another room, attending to hostess duties. But as the evening progressed toward midnight, her continued absence began to raise quiet concerns among those closest to her. Her personal secretary, Eleanor Marsh, began searching the public rooms, discreetly, at first, not wanting to alarm the guests. When she couldn't locate Linda, she enlisted the head butler, Thomas Brennan, who had served the Heiress family for 30 years. Together, they conducted a more thorough search while attempting to maintain the appearance that everything was normal. They checked the study that Linda had mentioned to Mrs. Ashford. It was empty, showing no signs of recent occupancy. They checked her private chambers on the second floor. The rooms were locked, and Linda did not respond to knocking. They checked the library, the morning room, the conservatory, even the kitchens where staff were still preparing late-night refreshments. Linda Heiress had simply vanished from her own party. By 12:30 a.m., Eleanor Marsh made the decision to alert one of the guests, Judge Whitmore, a family friend who could be trusted to handle the situation with discretion. The judge immediately grasped the severity of the situation. He quietly gathered a small group of trusted men, and they began a systematic search of the entire mansion, including areas that were not typically accessible to guests. They searched for over an hour while the party continued below, most guests still unaware that anything was wrong. They found nothing. No signs of Linda, no indications of disturbance, no clues to explain her disappearance. At 2:00 a.m., Judge Whitmore made the decision to inform all the guests and contact the police. The announcement sent shockwaves through the gathering. How could a woman simply disappear from her own home in the middle of a party attended by hundreds of people? The immediate fear was that something terrible had happened, that an intruder had somehow entered the mansion, that Linda had been attacked or abducted. Police arrived within 30 minutes. Chief Inspector Robert Dalton of the Rhode Island State Police took command of the investigation. He ordered the mansion sealed. No guests were to leave until they had been questioned. He dispatched officers to search the grounds with lanterns, focusing particularly on the rocky coastline below the mansion, fearing that Linda might have fallen or jumped. The interrogations lasted until dawn. Every guest was questioned about when they had last seen Linda, whether they had noticed anything unusual about her behavior, whether they had seen any strangers on the property. The testimonies were remarkably consistent. Linda had been entirely normal throughout the evening, showing no signs of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. As daylight broke on April 17th, the search expanded. Police officers, volunteer searchers, and private investigators hired by the family lawyers combed every inch of the estate. They searched the forests surrounding the mansion. They examined the coastline for any sign that Linda might have gone into the water. They questioned every servant, every delivery person, everyone who had any connection to the property. They found nothing. What they did discover, however, was something that shifted the entire investigation: inconsistencies in the mansion's architecture. Inspector Dalton, a meticulous man with 20 years of investigative experience, noticed that certain dimensions didn't match. The mansion's exterior suggested rooms of specific sizes, but the interior measurements revealed spaces that were smaller than they should be. There were walls that seemed thicker than necessary. There were sections of the basement that appeared to have been sealed off. On the third day of the investigation, April 19th, Inspector Dalton made the decision to bring in building contractors and architects to analyze the mansion's structure. What they confirmed was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Blackwood Mansion contained hidden spaces, rooms and passages that did not appear in any of the official architectural plans, modifications that had been made over decades without proper documentation. The question became, what was Linda Heiress hiding in those hidden spaces? And did her disappearance have anything to do with the secrets literally built into the walls of her home? Tell us in the comments what you think was happening so far. Was Linda Heiress a victim of foul play, or was there something more sinister at work within Blackwood Mansion? Your theories help us understand how these historical mysteries resonate across time. The decision to physically breach the mansion's hidden spaces was not made lightly. The Heiress family lawyers protested vigorously, citing property rights and family privacy. But Inspector Dalton had legal authority. A woman was missing, and the possibility that she was trapped somewhere within the structure gave him grounds to proceed. On April 21st, 1921, construction workers began carefully opening the sealed sections of the basement. The basement of Blackwood Mansion was already an unsettling space. Unlike the refined elegance of the floors above, the basement retained the rough stone construction of the original 1847 building. The ceiling was low, supported by thick wooden beams, darkened by decades of moisture from the nearby ocean. The lighting was poor, gas lamps that created more shadow than illumination. The air carried a permanent dampness and the smell of old stone and earth. The workers began in the eastern section, where architectural analysis had revealed the most significant discrepancy. There was a wall that appeared to be interior load-bearing structure, but the building's design suggested it shouldn't exist in that location. Using sledgehammers and pry bars, they carefully began removing the newer brick facade. Within hours, they broke through. Behind the false wall was a chamber approximately 20 feet square. The room had been furnished, though the furniture was unlike anything found in the mansion's main living areas. There was a heavy wooden table, its surface scarred and stained. There were cabinets filled with glass bottles containing liquids and preserved specimens that would later require scientific analysis. There were books, dozens of them stacked on crude shelves or piled on the floor. But what immediately drew everyone's attention were the walls themselves. Every surface had been covered in writing and symbols. Some appeared to be in English, though written in an archaic style. Others were in languages that none of the investigators immediately recognized. Later analysis would identify Latin, Greek, and what appeared to be older symbolic systems possibly derived from medieval grimoires. The symbols ranged from recognizable occult iconography to completely unique designs that seemed to have been created specifically for whatever purposes this room served. Inspector Dalton ordered the room sealed immediately and summoned experts, a professor of ancient languages from Brown University, a medical examiner, and representatives from the district attorney's office. The investigation had transformed from a missing person case into something far more complex. The books found in the chamber provided the first real insights into what Linda Heiress had been doing in secret. They were not the kind of volumes one would expect in a respectable home library. Many dealt with occult practices, ceremonial magic, alchemical processes, and what would today be recognized as fringe pseudoscience that blended mysticism with crude medical experimentation. Several books were extremely rare, first editions and manuscripts that collectors would have paid fortunes to possess. A few appeared to be unique copies, possibly brought back from Linda's European travels. Among these books, wedged between two larger volumes on a bottom shelf, investigators found something that would prove to be the key to understanding everything: a leather-bound diary with no external markings. The diary was approximately 8 inches tall and 6 inches wide, its cover worn smooth by handling. It was secured with a small brass lock that had been left unfastened. When Inspector Dalton carefully opened it, he found page after page of Linda Heiress's distinctive handwriting. He confirmed this by comparing it to known samples of her correspondence. The diary was extensive, containing entries that spanned from 1913 to just days before her disappearance. But unlike a typical personal journal, this diary read more like a laboratory notebook combined with philosophical meditation. The entries were organized, methodical, and deeply disturbing. The first entries that Inspector Dalton read, standing in that underground chamber with only lamplight to see by, made clear that everything Rhode Island society believed about Linda Heiress had been a carefully maintained fiction. She had been living a double life for nearly 8 years, and the diary was her confession, her chronicle, and her justification for actions that would horrify everyone who had celebrated her as a philanthropist. Inspector Dalton made an immediate decision. The diary's contents could not be made public, at least not immediately. What was written in those pages implicated not just Linda Heiress, but potentially others, described activities that would cause panic if revealed, and contained information that the investigator himself struggled to process. He took the diary, sealed the underground chamber, and reported to his superiors that significant evidence had been discovered that required careful analysis before any public statements could be made. It would be decades before the full contents of the forbidden diary began to emerge, shared in fragments by those who had read it, reconstructed through police reports and witness testimonies, pieced together by historians and researchers who understood that some truths, however terrible, must eventually be known. The forbidden diary of Linda Heiress began with entries from 1913, when she was 20 years old and had recently taken full control of the Heiress fortune. The early entries revealed a brilliant but profoundly disturbed young woman grappling with questions about human nature, morality, and the limits of knowledge. She wrote extensively about her childhood isolation, her relationship with her parents, and her growing conviction that conventional society operated on comfortable lies. She expressed contempt for the social circles in which she moved, describing them as performed humanity, all of us pretending at being civilized while harboring the same darkness that drove our ancestors to burn witches and conquer continents. What made these early entries particularly chilling was their cold rationality. Linda did not write like someone descending into madness. She wrote like a researcher documenting observations, like a philosopher working through logical arguments. Her language was precise, her reasoning carefully constructed, her self-awareness sophisticated. She described making a conscious decision to maintain what she called the public fiction of her identity, while privately pursuing what she termed genuine understanding. She wrote, "If society will not permit honest inquiry into human darkness, then inquiry must proceed in secret. I have the resources, the intelligence, and the isolation necessary to explore what others fear to examine." The diary documented how Linda began acquiring forbidden knowledge. She corresponded with European occultists, some of whom she had met during her travels before her parents' deaths. She purchased books through intermediaries, building a library of texts that dealt with subjects from medieval alchemy to contemporary theories about psychology and human behavior that mainstream academia rejected. But her interests went beyond reading. Linda wrote about wanting to move from theory to practice, from intellectual understanding to direct experience. This was where the diary's contents became increasingly disturbing. Beginning in 1914, Linda described what she called the project. She would use her wealth and social position to create opportunities for experimentation, testing theories about human nature, consciousness, pain tolerance, and what she believed were untapped capabilities of the human mind and body. Her philanthropic work, she revealed, served multiple purposes. Yes, she genuinely wanted to help some people. She saw no contradiction in this, but her charitable endeavors also gave her access to populations that society overlooked. Veterans suffering from shell shock and trauma, indigent, individuals with no family connections, people struggling with addiction or mental illness. These were people who might disappear without generating significant investigation, people whose testimony, if they ever spoke of unusual experiences, would be dismissed as delusion or confusion. The diary contained specific entries detailing how Linda would identify suitable candidates for what she called deeper study. She looked for individuals who were intelligent enough to articulate their experiences but isolated enough that their disappearance would not raise immediate alarm. She would offer them opportunities, employment at the mansion, medical treatment, financial assistance that would bring them into her private sphere. Inspector Dalton's report, written after his initial review of the diary, described finding entries that detailed at least 17 specific individuals whom Linda had brought to Blackwood Mansion over a period of 7 years. Not all of these cases resulted in harm. Some people had worked at the mansion briefly and left, but others had disappeared entirely, their fates unknown. Linda wrote about constructing the hidden chambers in the basement, hiring workers from outside Rhode Island who had no connection to the local community, paying them well to complete the work without asking questions. She wrote about soundproofing these spaces, about installing special locks and ventilation systems, about creating rooms that could be completely isolated from the rest of the mansion. What exactly happened in these rooms, the diary described in clinical detail that was both specific and euphemistic. Linda wrote about sensory experiments and consciousness trials and threshold testing in language that suggested scientific inquiry, but clearly described something closer to torture. She rationalized these activities by claiming she was expanding human understanding, discovering what people were capable of enduring, learning about the boundaries between sanity and madness. She also wrote about ritual practices, blending occult theories with her experimentation. She believed that certain extreme experiences could unlock what she called dormant capacities, enhanced perception, communication with what she described as entities beyond conventional reality, access to knowledge that transcended normal human consciousness. The most disturbing aspect of these entries was Linda's complete lack of remorse. She did not write like someone who believed she was doing wrong. She wrote like a researcher who had simply chosen a controversial field of study, who understood that others would not approve, but believed that future generations would recognize the value of her work. Inspector Dalton later testified that reading the diary's early sections left him profoundly shaken. This was not the writing of a monster in any conventional sense. This was the writing of someone who had convinced herself that the pursuit of knowledge justified any method, who had elevated her own curiosity above any consideration of human suffering. As investigators continued analyzing the diary and searching the mansion's hidden spaces, the scope of Linda Harris's activities became increasingly clear and increasingly horrifying. The diary contained names. Not all entries identified subjects by their full names, but enough information was provided that investigators could begin matching entries to missing person reports that had accumulated over the years. In various Rhode Island jurisdictions, one of the earliest names mentioned was Thomas Garrett, a veteran who had returned from the Great War, suffering from what was then called shell shock, and would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Linda had encountered him at a veterans support gathering she had organized in 1915. The diary described him as highly intelligent, articulate about his psychological state, isolated from family, desperate for treatment. She had offered him employment as a groundskeeper at Blackwood Mansion, with the promise of access to advanced medical care. Thomas Garrett had last been seen in October 1915. His disappearance had been reported by a fellow veteran, but the investigation had gone nowhere. He was assumed to have simply moved on, perhaps returning to his home state of Massachusetts. Linda's diary contained 12 entries related to Thomas, describing experiments involving sensory deprivation, induced trance states, and what she called controlled trauma reconstruction. The final entry about Thomas noted simply, "Subject proved less resilient than anticipated. Disposal required." That word, disposal, appeared multiple times throughout the diary. Linda never explicitly described what disposal meant, but the implication was unmistakable. Inspector Dalton ordered an expanded search of the mansion's grounds, particularly the rocky coastal areas and the dense forests surrounding the property. Another name was Sarah Mackenzie, a young woman who had sought employment through one of Linda's charitable programs in 1917. Sarah had been what was then termed a fallen woman, pregnant and unmarried, ostracized by her family, desperate for any opportunity. Linda's diary described her as perfect for reproductive studies, healthy, isolated, emotionally malleable. Sarah had disappeared in her 7th month of pregnancy. The diary contained clinical observations about pregnancy and childbirth that suggested Linda had kept Sarah hidden within the mansion until term, but no records existed of what happened to either Sarah or her child. The most extensive documentation involved a man named Isaiah Cole, an itinerant laborer with a background in theology. Linda had encountered him in 1918 and had been fascinated by what she described as his natural, mediumistic capacity. Over 16 months, she had conducted what she called progressive initiations, attempting to develop his purported psychic abilities through ritual. Practices, drug administration, and extended isolation. Isaiah's case revealed another dimension of Linda's activities. She had not been working alone. The diary made reference to what Linda called the circle, a small group of individuals who shared her interests in occult practices and extreme experimentation. She never provided full names, referring to them only by initials or cryptic designations. Dr. M, who provided medical guidance, Professor T, who contributed theoretical frameworks, Sister V, who participated in ritual work. These individuals apparently visited Blackwood Mansion periodically, meeting in the hidden chambers, participating in Linda's projects. This revelation horrified investigators. It meant Linda Heiress was not a solitary madwoman, but rather part of a network, possibly involving other respected members of society who were using their positions to pursue activities that violated every moral and legal standard. Inspector Dalton faced a profound dilemma. If he exposed everything the diary revealed, it would not only destroy the Heiress family name, but potentially implicate others, people whose identities he couldn't yet determine, but who clearly occupied positions of power and influence. The political and social ramifications could be devastating. Working with the district attorney and state officials, Dalton made a controversial decision. The investigation would continue in secret, focusing on identifying the other members of the network and determining what had actually happened to Linda Heiress, but the full details would not be released to the public. Official statements described the investigation as focused on Linda's disappearance, with some vague references to irregularities discovered at the property that were under investigation. The press reported that Linda Heiress had vanished under mysterious circumstances, that foul play was suspected, but no specific details were provided. Meanwhile, the secret investigation intensified. Forensic experts analyzed the hidden chambers, finding traces of blood, chemical residues, and other biological material that confirmed the diary's implications. Excavations around the property revealed buried items, clothing, personal effects, and in 2 locations, human remains that would take months to identify. The diary also contained entries about Linda's awareness that discovery was possible. In writings from early 1921, just months before her disappearance, she described feeling observed and suspected. She wrote about taking precautions, about creating contingencies. One entry from February 1921 was particularly ominous. If the fiction cannot be maintained, if revelation approaches, there are prepared alternatives. The work need not end simply because one location becomes untenable. This suggested that Linda had planned for the possibility of exposure, that she had prepared escape routes or alternative identities. It raised the question that would haunt investigators. Had Linda Heiress orchestrated her own disappearance, walking away from her old life to continue her work elsewhere under a different name? Or had something else occurred during that spring evening in 1921? Had the network turned against her? Had one of her victims managed escape and revenge? Had some experiment gone catastrophically wrong in ways that even the diary's disturbing entries couldn't fully capture? The answers remained elusive, hidden somewhere in the shadows of Blackwood Mansion and the secrets that Linda Heiress had taken with her wherever she had gone. The official investigation into Linda Heiress's disappearance was quietly closed in 1923, officially listed as unsolved with the presumption that she had met with foul play. The Heiress family estate was settled through probate, with the fortune distributed to distant relatives and charitable trusts. Blackwood Mansion was sold to private buyers who knew nothing of its history. But the story of Linda Heiress and the Forbidden Diary did not end there. Over the following decades, fragments of truth continued to surface, each revelation adding new dimensions to a mystery that refused to stay buried. In 1954, a clinical psychologist named Dr. Margaret Chen was conducting research at the Rhode Island State Archives for a book about early 20th century attitudes toward mental illness. While reviewing old police records that had been transferred to the archives, she discovered a sealed box, labeled only with a case number and the year 1921. The box required special permission to access, and when Dr. Chen finally obtained authorization, she found photocopied pages from what was identified as the Heiress document. Partial copies of Linda's diary that had been made by Inspector Dalton before the original disappeared. These copies were fragmentary, perhaps only 20% of the full diary, but they provided the first detailed public glimpse into Linda's mindset and activities. Dr. Chen was both horrified and fascinated. As a psychologist, she recognized elements that would later be associated with psychopathy: the lack of empathy, the grandiose self-concept, the ability to maintain a completely false social persona while pursuing hidden agendas. But she also noted Linda's genuine intellectual sophistication and her systematic approach to what she considered research. Dr. Chen attempted to publish an academic paper about the case, but she faced immediate resistance. The Heiress family lawyers, still protecting the family's reputation 3 decades later, threatened legal action. Brown University, where Dr. Chen had hoped to present her findings, declined to host the presentation. The psychological establishment of the 1950s was uncomfortable with the case's occult dimensions and the suggestion that someone from a prominent family could be capable of such acts. Dr. Chen ultimately published a heavily redacted version of her research in a small academic journal, referring to the case only as the H subject without identifying Rhode Island or providing specific dates. But she kept her full notes, and before her death in 1989, she donated them to the Rhode Island Historical Society, specifying that they should be made available to researchers. In the summer of 1967, workers renovating what had once been Blackwood Mansion made a disturbing discovery. The mansion had changed hands several times since the 1920s and had been converted into a private psychiatric hospital in 1958. During renovation of the basement to create additional patient rooms, construction workers broke through a section of wall that had been concealed behind later additions. Behind that wall was a small chamber, no more than 8 feet square, that had somehow been missed during the 1921 investigation. Inside was a collection of items that appeared to be personal effects from multiple individuals. Watches, rings, locks of hair tied with ribbons, photographs, and small journals or notebooks. The discovery was reported to police, who contacted the state archives. Forensic analysis of the items suggested they dated from the 1913-1921 period. Several of the photographs matched descriptions of missing persons from that era, though positive identification was difficult after so many decades. Most significantly, one of the small notebooks appeared to be a kind of index or catalogue, listing dates, initials, and cryptic notes that seemed to correspond to the subjects mentioned in Linda's diary. The notebook was not in Linda's handwriting, but in a different hand, possibly belonging to one of the mysterious members of the Circle that Linda had referenced. This discovery generated renewed interest in the case. A reporter for the Providence Journal, Michael Torino, began investigating, conducting interviews with elderly residents who remembered the 1921 scandal, tracking down descendants of people involved in the original investigation, and piecing together a more complete picture of the Heiress case. Torino's research revealed something that previous investigators had either missed or suppressed. There had been similar cases in other parts of New England during the same period. In Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont, there were reports of missing persons whose circumstances bore striking similarities to the Rhode Island cases. individuals who had been offered opportunities by wealthy benefactors and subsequently vanished. This suggested that Linda's circle might have been more extensive than anyone realized, that there might have been a loose network of privileged individuals throughout New England who shared Linda's interests and methods. Torino attempted to identify these individuals by cross-referencing social connections, but the trail was too cold. Most of the principals were long dead, and any records that might have existed had been destroyed or lost. Torino published a series of articles in 1968 that brought the Heiress case back into public consciousness. He was careful to focus on documented facts rather than sensationalism, but even the verified details were shocking. The series generated significant interest, including inquiries from true crime writers and documentary filmmakers. But once again, legal pressure from various sources led to the story being partially suppressed. The psychiatric hospital that now occupied the former mansion faced potential liability issues. Descendants of families that might have been connected to the Circle threatened lawsuits. The series was discontinued, and Torino was pressured by his editors to move on to other stories. Perhaps the most significant later revelation came in 1982, when a box of reel-to-reel tape recordings surfaced at an estate sale in Providence. The tapes had belonged to Arthur Brennan, son of Thomas Brennan, the head butler who had served at Blackwood Mansion during the Heiress era. The tapes contained recordings of interviews that Arthur Brennan had conducted with his elderly father in 1958, shortly before Thomas's death. In these interviews, the elder Brennan finally broke his silence about what he had witnessed at Blackwood Mansion. Thomas Brennan described a household where servants learned to ignore certain things, sounds from the basement, visitors who arrived after dark and were never formally announced, rooms that were absolutely forbidden. He spoke about Linda Heiress as a deeply troubled woman who displayed two completely different personalities depending on whether outsiders were present. Most disturbingly, Brennan revealed that he had suspected something terrible was happening as early as 1916, but he had said nothing. He had needed the employment. The Heiress family paid extraordinarily well, and he had convinced himself that he was mistaken about what he suspected. Even after Linda's disappearance and the subsequent investigation, he had told investigators only what they directly asked about, never volunteering. Additional information. Brennan also provided information about the night of Linda's disappearance that had never appeared in official reports. He stated that he had seen Linda leave the ballroom and proceed not toward the study, as she had told Mrs. Ashford, but toward the basement stairs. He had watched her descend, carrying what appeared to be a small valise. He had assumed she was retrieving something for the party and had thought nothing of it. But Linda had never come back up those stairs, at least not while Brennan was watching. He had been called away to attend to something in the kitchen, and when he returned to his post, the basement door was closed. Later, when the search began, he had mentioned seeing Linda go toward the basement, but in the chaos of the investigation, this detail had apparently been overlooked or not fully pursued. The tapes also contained Brennan's speculation about what might have happened. He believed that Linda had planned her own disappearance, that she had used the party as cover for an escape she had carefully orchestrated. He thought there might be passages from the basement that led to the coastal rocks, that Linda could have left the mansion without being seen, possibly meeting someone who had a boat waiting. But Brennan also acknowledged he could be wrong. Perhaps something had gone wrong with one of her experiments that night. Perhaps members of the Circle had turned against her. Perhaps one of her victims' families had discovered the truth and enacted revenge. He simply didn't know, and the uncertainty had haunted him for nearly 40 years. When these tapes became public in 1982, they generated the most extensive media coverage the Heiress case had received since 1921. Television documentaries were produced, books were written, Blackwood Mansion, still operating as a psychiatric facility, became a site of morbid fascination, with people driving out to photograph the Gothic structure and walk the coastal paths, where Linda might have made her escape. In 1995, an antiquarian book dealer in Boston contacted the Rhode Island State Police about a book that had been brought to him for appraisal. The book was a rare 19th-century grimoire, and tucked inside its pages was a letter dated March 1921, written in Linda Harris's distinctive hand. The letter was addressed to someone identified only as Dearest V, possibly the Sister V, mentioned in Linda's diary. The letter's contents suggested it was written approximately 1 month before Linda's disappearance. In it, Linda discussed feeling increasingly exposed and knowing that the end of this chapter approaches. She wrote about preparations she had made, about contingencies now in place, and about having secured the next location where the work will continue. Most intriguingly, the letter contained specific instructions about disposing of documents and materials from Blackwood Mansion, and it mentioned that the diary will remain, but only as misdirection. Let them think they understand. This final fragment suggested that the forbidden diary itself, the document that had been treated as the key to understanding Linda Harris, might have been deliberately left for investigators to find. That it might have been carefully constructed to present a specific narrative while obscuring the deeper truth. If this were true, it meant that everything investigators had believed about Linda Harris was based on what she had wanted them to believe. The diary might have been both confession and camouflage, revealing genuine horrors while concealing something even larger and more disturbing, a network that extended beyond Blackwood Mansion, activities that continued long after Linda's disappearance, secrets that remained protected even now. Today, more than a century after Linda Harris vanished from Blackwood Mansion, the truth about what happened that April night in 1921 remains elusive. The mansion itself still stands on that isolated promontory overlooking the Atlantic, though it has been converted from a psychiatric hospital to luxury condominiums. The new owners know little and care less about the property's history. The hidden chambers discovered in 1921 were sealed and built over long ago, but the questions persist. What really happened to Linda Harris? Where did she go? And perhaps most disturbingly, did her work continue elsewhere under a different name, in a different location? There are 3 primary theories that investigators, historians, and amateur researchers have developed over the decades. Theory 1: planned escape. This theory holds that Linda carefully orchestrated her own disappearance, using the spring gala as the perfect cover for an escape she had been planning for months. The 1995 letter supports this interpretation, suggesting that Linda knew exposure was coming and had prepared an alternative identity and location. Proponents of this theory point to several facts. Linda had vast financial resources and could have easily established secret accounts and arranged international transportation. She had connections throughout Europe from her travels. She had demonstrated sophisticated planning ability in maintaining her double life for nearly a decade. The timing of her disappearance, at the height of a crowded party, would have provided maximum confusion and multiple potential witnesses whose conflicting accounts would complicate investigation. If this theory is correct, Linda Harris might have lived for decades under a different name, possibly continuing her experiments in a new location where she had no established reputation to maintain. She could have died of natural causes in the 1950s or 1960s, her true identity never discovered, her secrets dying with her. Theory 2: murder by the circle. The second theory suggests that Linda was killed by members of her own network, the circle of individuals who had participated in her activities. Perhaps they decided She had become a liability, that her increasing recklessness threatened to expose them all. Perhaps there was a power struggle within the group, or a fundamental disagreement about how far their experiments should go. This theory would explain why Linda's body was never found. Her associates would have had the knowledge and resources to dispose of remains thoroughly. It would explain certain cryptic references in her diary about tensions with other members of the circle. And it would explain why the investigation seemed to encounter resistance from powerful but unidentified sources. If this theory is correct, Linda Harris's fate was ironic. Destroyed by the same darkness she had embraced, killed by people who shared her moral void. Her body might be hidden somewhere on the mansion grounds, buried in a location that even the extensive searches never discovered, or disposed of in the Atlantic Ocean that crashes endlessly against the rocks below Blackwood Mansion. Theory 3. Experimental catastrophe. The third theory holds that Linda fell victim to her own experiments, that something went catastrophically wrong during the night of April 16, 1921, that the activities she was conducting in the basement chambers resulted in her death in ways that even her diary's disturbing entries didn't anticipate. This theory is the most speculative, but also the most unsettling. It suggests that Linda's explorations into what she called consciousness expansion and threshold experiences might have involved risks she didn't fully understand, that her dabbling in occult practices, combined with experimental drugs and extreme psychological techniques, could have resulted in outcomes that transcended conventional explanation. Proponents of this theory point to the fact that Linda was never seen leaving the mansion, that no evidence of planned escape was ever discovered despite thorough investigation, and that the diary's final entries suggested she was preparing for something significant the night of the gala. They also note the persistent rumors, never officially documented, that some of the police officers who searched the mansion's hidden chambers reported experiences they couldn't explain, sounds, sensations, impressions that suggested something beyond ordinary reality. To this day, no one knows the truth. The forbidden diary of Linda Harris remains locked away in the archives of the Rhode Island State Police, accessible only to approved researchers. The various fragments and later discoveries have added pieces to the puzzle, but the complete picture remains obscured by time, by deliberate concealment, and by the simple fact that some secrets are buried too deep to ever fully uncover. What we do know is this: Linda Harris existed. Her double life was real. People disappeared, and the evidence suggests strongly that they disappeared because of her actions and those of her associates. The forbidden diary documented genuine horrors that challenged everything her society believed about the refined, charitable heiress they had celebrated. Whether Linda Harris escaped to continue her dark work elsewhere, whether she was killed by her own conspirators, or whether she fell victim to forces she had tried to control, we may never know with certainty, but her legacy remains, a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often those who wear the most convincing masks, who use wealth and position to hide in plain sight, who pursue their obsessions while society applauds them for entirely different reasons. Before we close, I want to ask, what do you think happened to Linda Harris? Do you believe she escaped and continued her experiments under a new identity? Do you think she was murdered by members of her circle? Or do you believe something stranger occurred within those walls, something that even a century later we still struggle to understand? Leave your theories in the comments, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to join our haunted community where we explore the darkest corners of forgotten history. The mystery of Linda Harris and Blackwood Mansion remains open, waiting for someone to discover the final piece of evidence that will reveal the truth. Perhaps that someone will be you. Until our next journey into the shadows of the past, remember, history's greatest horrors are often the ones that were never supposed to be discovered. Thank you for watching.